Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Son of a Blitch podcast. I'm your host, George Blitch. And today I got to sit down and have a wonderful conversation with Keith O'Brien, who is the author of this book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. This is an exceptional read, really talking about Pete Rose's life in a way that's never been put out before. Obviously, a lot of there's some books that Pete Rose has been a part of. I think that he's had some editorial controls. Not like this. This is a journalistic fastball right down the middle. It's going to tell you everything about Pete, about how he grew up, how, in the metrics in the day and age of analysis and baseball these days, he would never even be playing in the major leagues. But what did he have? He had connections and he had hustle. He had determination. He had things that were really kind of immeasurable in comparison to now, where you want to see, a hit count, what's your percentage on base, what is it that you're good for? Here's somebody that came in, was a very polarizing character in baseball, ended up being the all-time hit leader with 4,256 hits. And really, it was probably one of the first players that, we saw could have been a Hall of Fame player on his numbers, but has been denied the ability to appear on the ballot. And we talk about that. We talk really about the history of Keith and his journalism and his books. I mean, he's had 4 best-selling books. I definitely strongly encourage you guys to all check out the description below to look at the links and really get to see more of Keith's writing, because it is phenomenal. And this book is second to none. I've really, really want you guys to go check out a copy. If you love baseball, if you love the story of a Greek tragedy or an American tragedy, in this case, this is the rise and the fall of somebody who has gotten to the pinnacle at the top of the top and has, by his own actions and untruths and way of life, has fallen all the way down to the very valley of the mountains that he was on top of at one point in time. And so if you guys don't, if you don't know much about the history, I strongly suggest you go check out Keith's page. There's a lot of different reviews and things there that I think you can kind of give you a good picture of this story, kind of give you some Cliff Notes version, and then you can go ahead and purchase the book or go ahead and download the audiobook, which is, I read it and listened to it. Both were very entertaining. I really enjoy the audiobook for being able to, just listen as I'm driving around. And then also, we're going to be giving away 3 copies of Charlie Hustle. Talk to his publicist, so those are going to be out there. Details on that and how you can enter that giveaway will be forthcoming very soon. But without further ado, I want to jump into this podcast with Keith O'Brien. Thank you, Keith, again for joining me and sharing, your talents with the world with these amazing books, and especially Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Guys, enjoy the podcast, and thank you so much for tuning in. Take care. Hey, Keith, how you doing today, man?
I'm great, George. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Oh, well, I'm super stoked that you're here. Listen, I know we're going to be talking about a lot about your book, Charlie Hustle, right here, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. This is a phenomenal book, already a bestseller. And, I figured before we kind of jump into that and, talking about some of your other books that you've done too, maybe if we can kind of give listeners a little bit of 101, maybe talk about where you grew up and, maybe how you kind of gravitated getting into the writing and journalism world.
Well, so I'm from Cincinnati originally. Born and raised in Cincinnati, and my parents still live there today. And when I think about writing, and when I started to personally gravitate to it, for me, it probably doesn't happen until college. But my parents, of course, kept all my notebooks and such from elementary school. And when we were going through those a few years ago, I had this notebook in second grade where I was writing stories. And of course, I had forgotten about that completely.
Right.
But even then in second grade, I was writing these little stories. And so clearly it was something that was in me from an early age, even though I didn't personally identify it until I was in college.
So were there some people who were kind of a mentor in that capacity? Was that something that you were encouraged to write a lot? Was there somebody kind of lit that spark, or was that something you kind of just found on your own and that was a joy that you had?
Well, I always loved history and
Mhm.
stories of history in particular. And, there was a teacher in high school, Mr. Ott, Mr. Ott at St. Xavier High School in Cincinnati, Ohio, who, was the first person who ever assigned me a research paper. And, I remember that. And I remember loving being in the library and loving digging into old books about the topic I was writing about. And again, I was 14 or 15 years old at the time. I couldn't identify, what my interest really was, but I knew that I liked it. And certainly at college, there were plenty of professors who kindled that in me. But even when I graduated from high school or in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I became a history major at college because I knew I liked that, but I didn't know what I was going to do with that degree. I graduated from college with a history degree. I taught English in Japan for a year. I'm floating around, and it's only after I returned from Japan that I began to write for local newspapers on a freelance basis. I enjoyed the idea that somebody was going to pay me $300 to go tell somebody else's story. That seemed like a gift. It seemed like free money and an excuse to ask questions that I had no business asking. And that's really where it started, frankly.
Well, I definitely want to give some time talking about your other books, but I'm going to go ahead and just move that chapter down the road a little bit. I want to really jump into what it was that initially gravitated you to wanting to write a book about Pete Rose, because obviously you're from Cincinnati, so I mean, you can't help but live there and not have some of that Pete Rose in your life. And I'm sure that you, being a fan of baseball as you are, that was something too that was very gravitating in a sense of just who he is and that polarization of his character. But when did you first decide that, hey, I want to tackle a book on him? And what did that look like? Did you have something in mind when you made that decision, or, however that came to be, that you were like, I want to write it and I want to do it like this? Like, what was that structure looking like for you in your mind when that came to you?
So obviously, there's been a lot written about Pete Rose over the years, not just in magazines and newspapers, but of course, books. And so the first thing you have to think about when you're tackling a subject like that, a subject that's been written about many times, is how do I further the story? If I can't further the story, if I'm just going to, go over well-trodden territory, then really what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
And so, Pete Rose has been an idea that has existed for me on an idea list for a number of years. But the question was, how could I further the story? And for me, that was about access. I wanted to get access to Pete Rose. I wanted to get access to people in his inner circle. I wanted to tell this story from the inside. I feel like all too often, we have looked at Pete Rose's story through the prism of baseball. And to be clear, in my book, Charlie Hustle, there's a lot of baseball. But what's more interesting to me is the story of a man. I wanted to look at this through the prism of Pete being a man, an ordinary man, frankly, from the west side of Cincinnati, an ordinary working class part of town, where he was an ordinary athlete as a kid, never the best player on his own teams. But of course, does make the major leagues, does scrape and claw his way to the mountaintop. And then when he gets there to the mountaintop, loses everything through his own decisions, his own choices, his own addictions. That, to me, is just a compelling human tale. Regardless of what the person, what kind of profession the person had. And so that was the story I wanted to tell. I did believe that if I got access to Rose and his inner circle, people who knew him best, that I could tell it in a human way, that we had never read about it before. And so that was my goal. That was my process. That's how I thought about this story from the start. And I really did begin to think that this was far more than a baseball story. This really is a Greek tragedy. It has all the elements of a Greek tragedy, and it just happened to play out in and around an American baseball field. And when I got access to Rose, which I did, and got access to his inner circle, which I did, I knew from that moment that I had something far bigger here than any Pete Rose story that had been written before, and far bigger than just a baseball story.
Well, and you talk about that, and I think you said it was like 28 or 29 hours of like live interviews. You did a lot with Pete, and like he was texting you, like, "Are you ready?" Like he was jazzed up about getting together and putting this stuff out. And then, you go out to Vegas where he lives, and you end up doing some interviewing. And I think you talked about going on the road a little bit when he did some of the memorabilia stuff. And there was a point where that just ceased. Like the conversation stopped, and I was very curious. Was there something that you had brought to the table in discussion that felt maybe off limits to him? Or was there something that maybe, you were broaching a subject because, we can dive into it a little bit too. I think it's important to, because you talk about it in the book. There's definitely some things that, the idea of like when he dated a underage girl, or at least at the time it's in, people aren't sure exactly how old she was, but at least, 16, maybe 15 at the time. And he's almost double her age, and a married man. There's a lot of things that go on there that I thought maybe if that subject was, brought up, that maybe he'd be hesitant to, talk about it. But I was curious, what was it that, left that, departure when y'all are working together on this book at that time?
So, one thing that makes this book unique, aside from the things I already mentioned, is that I'm not here to make a case for Pete Rose. I'm not here to make a case against Pete Rose. And I think if you look at what's been written about Pete before, the books typically fall into one of those two categories. They're here,
black or white, right?
Yeah, to tell you he's the greatest or to tell you he's the worst. And what I was looking to do was tell the full story.
Mm-hmm.
There is a black version of Pete Rose. There is a white version of Pete Rose, and there's a lot of gray.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what I wanted to get into, was the gray, and write this story through granular reporting. Let people come to their own conclusions. And so, with that in mind, I wanted to talk to Pete about everything, and we did. I'm going to talk to him about those early days on the west side of Cincinnati when, by rights, he probably never should have made the major leagues. It is a true underdog story.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about those glory days of baseball. And when you look back at Pete's story, you realize you cannot write the story of baseball. Forget about the history. You can't write about the story of baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. So we're going to go back onto the field, in some of those great iconic baseball moments of the 20th century, moments that Pete is squarely in the middle of. And then, we got to talk about the hard stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
And, so we were talking about all of those things. And to Pete's credit, he did talk to me about things that he has never spoken about before. But I was pushing him.
Yeah.
And I was pushing him to really color outside the lines of the story he had previously told us, and pushing him to go places he hadn't gone before. And, while we didn't have a contentious conversation, we didn't have an argument or anything like that. It was clear that, I was pushing him to talk about things that he was uncomfortable discussing. And at one point in one of our last lengthy interviews, he did push back a little bit, and he's told me, we're talking, he said, about the dark days of my life now. And he wanted me to know that he'd had a lot sunnier days than dark.
Yeah.
And I told him that I knew that, and that we've talked a lot about sunny days, but we had to talk about the darkness. And my whole pitch here, not only with Pete, but with his friends, the people who ultimately introduced me to him and got me access to him, was that this was a time for reckoning. There's that sports cliche that, so-and-so is day to day with a shoulder injury, or day to day with a strained quad. Well, the reality is, man, we're all day to day, all of us.
Yep.
But when you're in your 80s, as Pete Rose is, and as are the people who were his contemporaries, that notion of being day to day is especially present. And so this, to me, was a time for reckoning. I was pushing Pete to reckon. And I think ultimately, George, I pushed him as far as he was willing to go.
Well, and I think with, when I think about Pete Rose and who he is, like, he loves to control the story, the narrative. I think in another interview you talked about how kind of like he's like a sun, and there's things that like people in orbit around him, and there is a very, very self-important feeling that he comes across in a lot of interviews and a lot of different things. And there's this bigger than life, persona. And I feel like, people, when they get around him, it seems like he's somebody who has always given them attention, made them feel special. And I think there's a lot of people around there, and you kind of shape that in your story, in your book there, about how a lot of people wanted to have a piece of Pete Rose in that sense too. And I wondered about that when y'all were talking about, if all of a sudden, if there's a click in his mind, like he can't control this narrative, or, now someone else is in the driver's seat, because all the books previous to this have always had some kind of affiliation where he's kind of guiding it, it seems. Is that kind of the case that you've seen before this? Because this feels like a whole different book in that sense, because it's really a 360 view of him, and it's not him pushing that ball forward.
Well, right. To be clear, Pete Rose had never spoken before to an author for a book unless he had some kind of editorial control and unless he was being paid for it. And I want to be very, very transparent here. He did not have editorial control over this book, and he was not being paid. This was going to be a work of history, a work of journalism from the start, and he knew that. And so, absolutely, I think, as we got into some of the more difficult topics, I think it made him uncomfortable, to know that he did not have control. In fairness to him, we all want control over our story.
Sure.
We all of us, whether we're famous or not, like to tell the best version of the story that reflects well on us. I think that's human nature.
Yeah.
But Pete is particularly good at this.
Yes.
He actually has made a career. He's made a lifetime out of rebranding moments, to reflect best upon him. He did it throughout the entirety of his baseball career. I think in some ways he's still doing it today. This is, again, not a trait that is unique to Pete Rose. Many politicians have this skill as well. Pete Rose absolutely has it. And while he would not use the term rebrand, that's not something he would say, it is something he does. Yeah. Many times over the course of his life. He rebrands something, spins it in his direction. And I did, that analogy you mentioned, about Pete being a sun in a universe, is something I identified early on. And it was something I identified really because I did get that access to him. He is like a sun in a universe that he almost created out of his own hand. And in that universe where Pete is this sun, there are countless planets orbiting him. Some of them, are still close to him, and they need his light and warmth and attention. They want it. They live off of it. And others are planets that are cold and distant, that are no longer, in need of that light, or can no longer have it even if they wanted it. And whether I want to be or not, I am now in this universe. I am one of those planets. And I will say it's a very strange place to be. It's a place where chain reactions happen all the time, especially when someone like me is calling people and asking questions and digging up old stories. And all the reporting I've done now, 30 years really of a journalism career, I've never reported a story like this before, where one call to a certain person could set off a chain of events with multiple others, and phones are ringing all across America because of a story that is broken, or a question that has been asked, or a new revelation that has been made. The reality is, whether you like Pete Rose or not, whether you cheer for Pete Rose or not, he is a controversial, compelling, polarizing American icon, and the universe that he lives in is a very, very strange one.
It definitely seems it. And you talked about, I think it was great for me because I never really understood a lot of his backstory with his like father taking him out to the gambling track, right? I think it was the horse races or the dog races or maybe both. But there's a sense where you're like, oh, he was really shown this and experienced this, gambling lifestyle at a very young age. And it was his dad was, teaching him, it's almost like it's like the Ricky Bobby, right? Your first or your last. Like you have to win. Like there is like no excuses. You're giving everything you can. I mean, obviously his hustle was undeniable. There was not another player who came through like that. A man gets walked and he's sprinting to first base. Who does that? He does that. And it was something that some people, I mean, I think even like you talked about it too, like the idea of the name Charlie Hustle. It wasn't necessarily a kind thing at first. Didn't it come from Mickey Mantle? What was that? If you can kind of talk about that story real quick, and then we'll jump into what the other thought I had.
Yeah, so Charlie Hustle, P. Rose's nickname, also the title of my book, I think is a critical moment. And anytime there is a critical moment in P. Rose's narrative, a turning point, a pivot point, a high or a low point, that's a place where I wanted to do a lot of reporting. And certainly the creation of this nickname is one of them. I do think that the name itself and the persona behind it is one reason why fans, liked P. Rose. One reason why we gravitated to P. Rose. This is sort of the American story, P. Rose. If you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, anything can happen. That is the American story. Sure. That is the story we tell our kids and our grandkids. That's the story we tell ourselves. And to me, where it begins was critical, and I was able to identify it. This nickname was given to Pete during a spring training game on a Sunday in March 1963, March 17th, 1963. This is Pete Rose's third spring training with the big club, and it's the first spring training where there's a chance, an outside chance, that he could make the major league roster. And by this Sunday, March 17th, that chance is especially present. He's starting that day against the New York Yankees. This was going to be a big game. The Reds and the Yankees did not play each other in these years. These are the preeminent Yankees: Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, Yogi Berra, Roger Maris. The game is being televised live back in Cincinnati, a spring training game. This never happened. And it's a sellout. It's a sellout at Old Al Lopez Field down in Tampa, Florida. In a scene we can't imagine today, people have scaled the light posts in the outfield to get a better view of the field. And who's sitting behind home plate? None other than P. Rose's own father, the man who's been pushing him all these years to hustle. And P. Rose plays that day in the way we'll come to know him to play later. He plays with fury. He leads off the game as the leadoff hitter, gets on base, scampers all the way around the bases, scores the first run of the game. He later breaks up a double play, sliding hard into second base in a practice game. And then, to lead off the fifth, P. Rose drops down a bunt for a hit. And this seems to be like the breaking point for the Yankees. And some kind of conversation happens on the top steps of the visitors' dugout there at Al Lopez Field. And Whitey Ford and Mickey Mantle are having a conversation about this kid, rookie, nobody, Pete Rose. And it's important to note that, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford are like the opposite of Pete. These are two men who've been touched by the hand of God, with innate baseball talents. They don't have to work hard and hustle to be great. They just are great. And they're laughing at this kid at watching him play. And what they say exactly isn't clear. In the days ahead, some newspaper articles will say that they called him Henry Hustle. Other newspaper articles will say that they called him the, quote, Charlie Hustler. And it's only after a number of days that the press decides that what they called him was Charlie Hustle. And P. Rose loves it. And even though it's not intended to be a compliment, even though they're effectively laughing at him for playing so hard, when he makes the big league club that spring, and when he becomes the starting opening day second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds, and when he travels for the very first time to Chicago and New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, visiting cities he never thought he'd see, and meets reporters there, Pete Rose does that thing that we mentioned before. You know, he rebrands this nickname, and he tells all the beat writers that Mickey Mantle saw him play, liked what he saw, and called him Charlie Hustle. And that to me is just such a Pete Rose story. It is a quintessential Pete Rose story. It captures everything about his personality, and it also, you know, captures that thing I mentioned before. It really encapsulates why we will come to cheer for him, because again, we will, as fans, come to cheer for Pete Rose.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up and I always thought, look at this guy. He's one of the hardest workers. He's the huge hustler. And thinking about in my mind like, that he was this naturally gifted baseball player, you know, and then really being able to unfold the chapters of his history that he was not. He was definitely not one of the best. And like you talked about, there's like a lot of like tournament balls. Here's a picture, and it's like, here's this tiny little guy. And he ended up having connections that he used. Like his uncle had worked with the Cincinnati Reds. And was he a scout? Was that what I kind of forget? So
yeah, his uncle was essentially like a bird dog scout in southwestern Ohio.
yeah, so like he uses these connections in order to get himself in that position to even have this opportunity, of which in this day and age, he probably never would have gotten picked up by a scout. He never would have maybe even played college baseball. He did not have the thing that they were looking for, that the Mickey Mantles, the Whitey Fords, or any of these other kinds of guys, the Johnny Benches of the world had. But there was some tenacity. There was this hard work. There was the undeniable spirit of he's going to give everything he can to become a winner, because he wanted to sit there and be on that podium. He wanted that attention. And there was a narcissistic kind of sense to him that I gathered. But there was also, you know, I feel like you did such an amazing job of painting a 360 picture of who he was. You get to see some of the reasons why he might have had this type of mental, you know, tenacity, this type of like need to fill out a hole in that maybe he had in his life from his, you know, needing to get that attention from his parents or from his dad, you know, like that he like proved people wrong, right? There is a, like you talk about that too. I love that idea too. That's like, you know, it is like the American tragedy, right? But seeing him in all of his successes, I mean, it's undeniable. He's the hit king, right? And, you know, 4,256, is that the number?
Yeah, 4256.
So,
yeah.
I mean, there's no one that's probably ever going to touch that. There's things that he has done. There's World Series titles. There are accomplishments that this man has had that in any other day, in any other situation, would have put him squarely at the very top in the Hall of Fame. However, I think, you know, for those who may not know maybe some of the intricacies, and I think a lot of folks who follow baseball do, but, you know, I have some listeners that may be, you know, approaching the subject for the first time. Could you lay out why he is not in the Hall of Fame? I mean, you talk about it in your book again, but I want to like maybe have you just spend a couple minutes on this and talk about, you know, why is he not on the ballot? What happened? How did this happen where Giamatti dies and then, you know, how someone else comes in? And let's just talk about that for a minute if you can. I know it's a very, you know, detailed process there too, but if we can kind of share, you know, give some highlights of that so people can maybe understand why this is a polarizing discussion on should he or should he not be in the Hall of Fame.
Oh my gosh, polarizing discussion. Are you kidding me? This is like the great late night sports bar argument that everybody's had if you're a sports fan, and they're still
decades
today.
Yes.
I mean, it's one of the most polarizing sports arguments.
Yes.
I want to go back to, I will answer that question. I want to go back to what you said a second ago, because I think it's important. In the analytics age, the age we're living in now, where, you know, scouts and bean counters and baseball nerds are tabulating stats that will, you know, become the measure of a man and the measure of a youth athlete. And it goes all the way back, you know, down to the youth athletes these days. Yeah. Pete Rose never makes it. He would have never stood out. And indeed, he doesn't stand out in the 1950s and even in the early 1960s. You know, scouts will visit, Major League scouts will visit his high school on the west side of Cincinnati, and they will have no interest in young Pete Rose at that time. So he, by rights, should have never been a name we knew, probably wouldn't be a name we know today. And yet, 42-56, the hit record that I do believe will never fall in an age where players are no longer, trying to, punch a single through the hole between first and second just to get on base. The analytics would tell them, no, swing away. We'll take a strikeout or a double off the wall. We'll take a strikeout or a home run rather than a bunt down the third base line. So, probably never should have existed, wouldn't exist today. And yeah, is this polarizing debate? So, ultimately, what happens in 1989? Pete Rose, is accused initially of betting on baseball and the Reds. He denies it. Bart Giamatti, then the commissioner of baseball, and his right-hand man, Deputy Commissioner Fay Vincent, hire a man named John Dowd, a highly qualified and experienced former Justice Department lawyer, to unravel this case, unravel the truth, and unravel ultimately Pete Rose's lies. And in a stunning work of a first draft of history, John Dowd and his team does that, and in a matter of 8 to 10 weeks, builds a dossier on Pete Rose that really does unravel years and years of lies. But Pete Rose refuses to admit to the truth at that time. Still it maintains he did not bet on baseball, did not bet on his own team, the Cincinnati Reds, but will ultimately agree to his own banishment in August of 1989, because there were rules, and are still rules, that you cannot bet on baseball if you are playing in the games. That is the best known rule in baseball. And if you do that, it was well known to any player, including Pete Rose, that you faced a permanent banishment. So he does. But when Pete Rose signs the agreement, because he does sign to it, and he does agree to it in August 1989, that he's going to be permanently ineligible, he believes full well that his name will appear on the ballot at the Hall of Fame 2 years later in 1991, which would have been 5 years after his last at bat as a player. It's only in early 1991 that the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown changes the rules, essentially moves the goalposts, and says that only eligible players, only players in good standing, can appear on the ballot to be elected at the Hall of Fame. It is effectively the Pete Rose corollary.
Right.
And the baseball writers, the voters, are livid. Whether they were going to vote for Pete or not, they're furious, because this is the very first time that the Hall of Fame has effectively pre-screened a player out of the pool of potential candidates. Removes him from the pool of candidates. And, at the time, many of these baseball writers and voters will write columns criticizing the decision. And some of Pete's contemporaries also criticized the decision. And one of those people was Pete Rose's good friend, former manager of the Cincinnati Reds and a future Hall of Famer himself, Sparky Anderson. And Sparky Anderson says that month in February 1991, when they changed the rules, that it's a mistake. He said, because we will never be able to hash out the Pete Rose problem, this case, he said, would loom over baseball forever. And, Sparky made a lot of mistakes along the way in the Pete Rose narrative. It's pretty clear from my reporting that Sparky knows in the 1970s that Pete's hanging around with a crew of guys he probably shouldn't be with. It's an open secret by the late 1970s that Pete is gambling, and he's gambling a lot on sports, on football, on basketball. He's hanging around with lots of bookies. But Sparky Anderson is 100% right about this, because here we are 35 years later. Sparky Anderson is gone, not with us anymore.
Mhm.
Pete Rose is 83 years old. The world has moved on and changed a million times over, and yet this problem of Pete Rose is still looming over baseball.
Well, and the timing of this release of this book too, and the story of the Ohtani allegations were just mind blowing. I was like, here we are in baseball talking about. I mean, and this goes back to it too, and I think we need to definitely make mention too. It's like it was the 1918 World Series. Is that the one or 1917? The betting
1919 World Series.
1919. Sorry. So, Chicago White Sox there, and that scandal there, and like these players basically were reached through bookies and through potential mafia. And I don't know the full details there, but as far as like they threw the games for the World Series, and that completely almost destroyed the integrity of this game. And so that, rules and regulations came about to make sure something like that never happened again. It's very clear in every single ball club, and it's very, very prominently displayed that you cannot bet on baseball. So he has looked at that and looked in the face of it, but I'm Pete Rose, and whatever his, or if it's maybe this, addiction that started because of how he got brought up into this by his dad, and seeing, this going on and betting so much and gambling and getting involved with, some shady characters along the way, as the book talks about. And I feel like, this idea that betting and baseball always had to be completely separated, but yet right now we are seeing, I've seen it in Major League Baseball, stadiums. Here it is, place your bets, go ahead and get, your free credits by, entering in your, ticket number, whatever it is. It is very integrated now into online gambling. I think, there was a figure you had, there's $120 billion were wagered in sports last year alone. It is something that is so prominent now, and there are commercials that are, whatever it is, DraftKings or whoever it may be, this week, that baseball is, it feels very strange to me as a fan who has realized and has been aware of the Pete Rose no betting on baseball and what it's done to his career and how it's stopped him from being able to even be considered to the Hall. The timing of this and the Ohtani allegations, if you could just kind of talk to me a little bit about the culture, and then also maybe if you could also address the idea of the last glory days of baseball. When do you feel those ended, and what do you see in the game now that maybe, and how you feel about this in the betting and how this is all kind of circling around the game right now?
Well, yeah, lots to unpack there.
Sure.
Yeah, happy to do it. So, I guess let's start with a defense of Major League Baseball for a moment. You mentioned the gambling figures, $120 billion legally wagered last year alone on sports. Just to put that in perspective, $120 billion. If we had instead pooled our money, collectively pooled that money instead of wagering it on sports, we could have collectively purchased every single Major League Baseball team and still had about $40 billion jangling around in our pockets. So it's an enormous sum of money. And so any league would be making an economically disastrous decision not to partner with the legal betting platforms. The market will dictate what companies do. And Major League Baseball is a company. Mm-hmm. And, the market is telling us, people want to bet on the games. So, it would be folly for Major League Baseball not to partner with the legal gambling platforms. And their argument will be that as a result of these partnerships, the game is safer. And there's an element of truth to that. When you place a bet on your phone, if you do that, there are people watching in real time. And by people, I mean AI software platforms. I have a legal betting app on my phone. Gambling is legal in New Hampshire, where I live. And, I may from time to time use that legal betting app to place a $10 or $20 bet on a game. If tonight I'm in, let's say, Houston, and I place a $10,000 bet on the Astros to win, that is going to be flagged in real time, because that is a bet that is out of the norm of my betting behavior. And they will be able to, in a matter of minutes, identify where I have placed that bet, where I'm standing, when I place that bet, with my IP address and my location services. And with that, they could, pull the game off the board. This has happened already in sports. So there are these levels of protection that exist. However, if we learned anything from the recent scandal in Los Angeles involving Shohei Ohtani and his former interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara, it's that illegal bookies still exist. And these guys today are not the kind of bookies that Pete Rose bet with in the 1970s and 80s. They're not guys in a back room of a restaurant or the basement of their house on a landline. Many of the illegal betting platforms and bookies have their own software that is housed offshore. Some of these illegal platforms look just as polished as the legal ones. And people are placing bets with illegal bookies still today to the tune of $60 billion. Not an insignificant sum. So, and when you place bets with illegal bookies, there is nobody watching. Just as there was nobody watching in the 1970s and 80s when Pete Rose did it, there's hardly anyone watching now. There's no AI software device that's tracking those bets in real time. So any player or friend in an inner circle around the players today knows, of course, they can't place a bet on their phone with DraftKings or FanDuel or BetMGM. They can't go to the legal betting kiosks outside many of the stadiums or at the gates of many of the stadiums today. They have to do it with illegal bookies or they're going to get caught. And so, I think what Major League Baseball argues is true. In some ways, we are safer. But I think, there's a great risk of what's happening right now today, too. And we've seen it. We talked about Shohei Ohtani and his interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara. But in recent, weeks, an NBA player has been banned for sharing information about prop bets related to his performance alone. And here's the reality of the situation. In Pete's day, Pete Rose's day, you had to have access to a bookie in order to place a bet. And not all of us did in the 1970s and 80s. And not all of us would have wanted to assume that risk. A lot of bookies in the 70s and 80s, I would argue almost all of them, either were part of organized crime or they were on the fringes of organized crime. Sure. And none of them worked alone. They were all in conjunction with each other. And so you had to assume a certain amount of risk and know people in that kind of world to get to a bookie in the 70s and 80s. Today, we can all do it on our phones. From the comfort of our couches and our pajamas and our sweatpants. We can do it from the seats at the stadium watching the game. I was at the Red Sox game the other night, and I was standing in line, at the concession stand in the middle of the game. And the two guys behind me were talking about the bets they had already lost during that game, placing bets in real time on the game, and strategizing for what bets they might place for the remainder of the game. Now, that's what Major League Baseball wants. They want a couple of young men, at the concession stand talking about their in-game bets and what they might place bets on later in the game. But who else is a young man? Well, the players themselves. And what do they have? Tons of free time and tons of disposable cash. And so I think the reality of the situation is we're going to see more and more scandals around all of the sports. And the only question is it going to rise to the level of the Pete Rose scandal in 1989? It's not a question of if, it's just a matter of when.
Great points, man. I really appreciate your insight on that. And I think it's very true. It's especially in this day and age where footsteps are recorded, fingerprints are like everything you do is trackable, traceable, and those things will come out. It's I always say like the truth will find the way. It gets found, right? So these players may try to have someone else place bets, but eventually, if there's some text messages, people investigate enough. There's enough breadcrumbs that are laid down to where you can find that out, and that's where we'll find out on some of these things what the truth of the matter is. Are these people guilty of what they've been, accused of? And I want to return to this because you talk about the last glory days of baseball. What do you think was the ending of the glory days of baseball? What do you mean by that? For those who haven't seen the book or read the book yet or listened to it, great Audible, by the way, great audio book, as well as the writing. But I wanted to just have you kind of touch base on that. What was it that you felt was that transitional point of the glory days being over?
Well, I want to be clear. I'm still a baseball fan.
Yeah, we're just there.
Follow the game. I was just at the Red Sox game the other night, and someone, told me, and I think there's an element of truth in this statement, that the glory days of baseball for anyone is whenever you were 12 and 14 and 15 years old. That's your glory days of baseball. And, there's some fairness in that. But here's the deal, despite the current popularity of the game, and there are lots of data points to suggest that baseball is popular and just as popular as it's ever been, it does not, objectively does not, carve out the slice of the American consciousness today as it did 30, 40, 50 years ago. It simply doesn't. I would argue that if you walked around and randomly surveyed people and asked them who played in the World Series last fall, that the majority of people would not be able to answer that question. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is just the fracturing of the media and how we consume sports. Across all of the sports, with the exception of the NFL and to a certain extent college football, all of the sports are decidedly, carving out a smaller slice of our consciousness today than they once did. But, baseball was America's most popular sport. That's not my opinion. There were surveys that showed that again and again. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was an annual survey done every year asking Americans, what's your favorite sport? And all the way up through the 1960s, the number one answer, often not even close, was baseball. But after the Super Bowl III and Joe Namath's upset over the Baltimore Colts, the Jets beating the Colts, the old AFL, beating the NFL, this grand upset, it starts to swing the other way. And for the very first time, football is now more popular than baseball. That is a trend that begins, in 1969, 1970. It continues to this day. Meanwhile, there are many things that happen within baseball itself that just make it far less interesting for the average American to watch. Again, not my opinion. There's lots of television ratings that prove that bear that out. And I think it's interesting and notable that in 1989, when Bart Giamatti rightly investigated Pete Rose and pulled out all the stops to do that, at least a couple of players, maybe more, were already injecting themselves with steroids in Major League Baseball. And they were doing so in the summer of 1989 in Oakland, California. Jose Canseco is on the record. He was already on steroids in 1989. I think what steroids would do to baseball over the coming 15 to 20 years would have an adverse effect on the game. It guts the numbers. It guts the records that we cared about. It forces players who weren't even on steroids to start swinging for the fences when they see that if you hit more home runs, you get a bigger financial windfall, a bigger contract. All of those things affect league batting average, affect the speed of the game, affect the movement of the game, and lead to the rule changes that I would argue we saw last year, where baseball rightly again tried to speed up the game and create more movement, more hits, fewer strikeouts, fewer home runs, and so I think all of that, to me, without question, suggests that the last glory days of baseball, anyway, were the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm not to suggest that there's not great baseball ahead, but to suggest that we're ever going to get back to where we were in those days, I think is wrong.
Great perspective there. I think a lot of folks also lost some interest, even though it was like gaining the excitement when you see these power hitters, these guys that were juiced up. And, just to mention it too, it's like there was legalized methamphetamine type things, the greenies. There's pills that have been out there that have been used, that have been in the clubhouses for years. There's things that Major League Baseball has known about, but they've looked the other way at times, I feel like. And then there's times they've tried to crack down on things because like, oh, this problem got too big, we need to shut it down. And I think that you see those steroids, those power hitters, everyone wanted to see these records get broken, except for some people who I think maybe came from those glory days of like, yeah, but that'd be attainted, man. We're going to have to throw an asterisk by that. And I think there's like a different kind of era of baseball that we see. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion on this idea too, of like, one, I know that you have laid everything out in this book to where people can draw their own conclusions. And I feel like in your, truth to journalism, you've laid these things out to where I don't feel like your opinion is basically a trajectory through the book. I feel like the truth is through the book, and you've done such a wonderful job of painting that and leaving us to our own self to make our own feelings. I've learned more about Pete Rose, and there's parts of me that I feel sorry for him. There's parts of me that I go, ooh, I really don't like that aspect of him. But no matter what, I learned more about him that I ever would have in any other book. And I've read some things about for and by Pete Rose. And this idea too of like, now I think that ultimate question, should he ever be allowed to be on the ballot? And is there anything special that we need to do? Because I believe there was an interview you talked about where there may be like in this era too, where there's a lot of folks who are on that fringe now. It's like, should we allow them on the ballot? There's been, evidence of, the Barry Bonds. There's been, allegations with the Roger Clemenses of the world. There's people of, Jose Canseco, who've put up some numbers, who have done some things that are so extraordinary that they would probably, minus any of this sidebar stuff, would have been in already, but are not, or maybe might not be considered. And I kind of wanted to hear your opinion on what you think, if he should ever be on the ballot. Do you think he will? If he should, how should that be treated? Should there be something where an asterisk by these folks, and should we be basing it on their on-field play, or should their character come into play? And I know it's a lot to unfold, but I feel like I've kind of heard you talk about this a little bit, and I wanted to see and have you share your opinion with listeners about that, whole ordeal.
Yeah. So, obviously as a sports fan, I've wrestled with this as a fan, for decades, all of these, kinds of folks. And while it isn't part of the book, my opinion is not part of the book in any way, shape, or form, intentionally so. Mm-hmm. Of course, I do have my own feelings about it. And my prevailing thought now, George, is just that we've completely lost perspective. I think we like to put athletes on pedestals. We like to ascribe moral values to them that they may or may not deserve, that they may or may not even have. And the fact is, we simply do not know much about these guys. And I think the Shohei Ohtani scandal in recent weeks shows that again. And obviously there is no evidence that Shohei was involved in the gambling allegations in Southern California involving his former interpreter, Ipe Mizuhara. But no one a month ago would have ever predicted that this kind of scandal would be on the fringes of his inner circle. No one would have predicted that. So we don't know these guys. We don't know what we don't know about these guys. And so for that reason, my prevailing belief, not just about Pete Rose, but about the steroid guys, about everyone, who's tied up in that scandal. So the Barry Bondses and the Roger Clemens and the Alex Rodriguez's of the world. I believe now that we should enshrine or not enshrine them into the Hall of Fame based on what they did on the field. It is the only thing we know for sure. And then if what they did off the field is so wrong, so egregious, let's put it on the plaque at Cooperstown next to their glorious accomplishments. That is my prevailing belief at this point. The fact is that's what the Hall of Fame was for a long, long time. When the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown was conceived in the 1930s, and when the first class was voted in 1936, and for many decades to follow, there was no ink spilled in newspapers debating the moral worth of the men on the ballot. Many of these men who were on the ballot and who are now in the Hall of Fame were objectively the kind of folks that we would consider to be not very good men. The Hall of Fame is filled, with all sorts of characters, racists, philanderers, cheaters, liars, gamblers, drug dealers, drug users. They're all there. And so, it's only in recent decades that we have started to ascribe moral values to our athletic icons. And I just think it's almost sort of ridiculous.
Well said, man. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I can completely agree. And, I'm very curious to see what happens. I personally feel like if he ever is on the ballot, it's not going to be until after he has passed. I don't think in Pete's lifetime he's going to see his name there. But then that's just a personal thought of mine, but we'll see what happens. And it's by his merit alone on all of it, the numbers, if we're looking at that, it's undeniable. He deserves to be there. But, you cross the line and you lie about it for years. And only in recent years has he come through and been at least finally honest about it. But you lose a lot of trust and a lot of, I think, support along the way when you've steadfastly said, no, this is the truth. And okay, I was lying this whole time. And again, I feel like there's a lot of things in your book that let us understand maybe a little bit more of the whys and the hows of his mindset, and maybe, why he made certain decisions. And, some things will always be left to chance and question. But I really felt like you did such an amazing job of painting a picture of him that we can draw our own conclusions. And, the journalistic ability that you put to this is, it's kind of rare in certain circumstances these days. A lot of stuff, it's just for clickbait things, but, there's an integrity that you held true that I deeply respect as a writer myself. And, before we leave, I had a couple last questions here. I wanted to ask, as far as your own personal and professional legacy, how do you view all this? You have 4 best-selling books. You've done thousands of articles, maybe tens of thousands of interviews over your lifetime. You've left a lot of fingerprints behind for us to see, some things that you found important to you to work on, which are really great. And we'll, definitely point some folks in that direction here in a second. But I just wanted to get your idea about legacy. How do you view it? Is that something that you actively think about, and the things you're putting through and building a living legacy? And how do you hope to be remembered?
Oh my gosh, George, what a big question.
I saved it for the end, right? And there's the slow pitch.
You did a nice slow pitch for the end. I mean, listen, like most people, I'm just trying to get through the day, get through the week. I'm not thinking about things like legacy until someone like you asks a question about it. But since you've asked it, most importantly, I want to be remembered, as a good father, a good husband, a good person. Full stop. Leave the writing aside.
Yep.
As a writer, though, one thing that I really try to do, and I pride myself on, and did try to do with this book, with Charlie Hustle, is look at anyone's story with empathy. No one knows what another person is going through. And so, when I interviewed people for this book, and it's a book where even today, not everybody in the room sees it the same way. The witnesses to the same moment, the same argument, the same wager, the same night in the bar, the same night at the racetrack have conflicting stories or feelings about what happened there. When I did those interviews and met with those people who lived that life who lived those moments, I tried to understand it from their perspective. I'm not saying in the end that I might have agreed with it or that the facts bore out what they saw that night or what they felt, but I did try to see it that way. And so, there is, aside from Pete Rose, hundreds of other interviews that were done for this book, with people who were there in his inner circle, people who had that front row seat to Pete Rose's rise and Pete Rose's fall, and some of whom, fell with him, paid a price for that friendship or that loyalty. And in every word and every paragraph that I wrote in this book, I tried to write it with not just accuracy, not just an adherence to the truth or the closest version of the truth, but also to an empathetic view of the people who lived that life and were there that night in what is ultimately an epic story, an epic American story. And as a writer, that's just something I try to do in every story all the time.
That's wonderful. And, I know we need to wrap this up here too, but I want to make sure that people who not only are going to go out and, check out Charlie Hustle, but your other amazing books too. You got Paradise Falls, Fly Girls, Outside Shot. I know that, they can learn a little bit more on your website. So why don't we just tell people where they can go and follow you, learn more about some of the projects that you've been a part of and some of the things you may have coming up. And if you can just go ahead and plug your socials and your website so that, people can go ahead and place some orders.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, George. Well, yeah, my website is keithob.com. My Twitter handle is the same, KeithOB, and I'm on Instagram at O'Brien Story. And all, all of those books you mentioned, you can find anywhere they sell books.
That's great. Well, there's some amazing writing that you've put out. You've shared some wonderful stories, perspectives, truths, and like I said, the integrity that you hold in your writing is something that I definitely look up to and appreciate. And I just thank you so much for taking the time today to, chat with me and talk more about Charlie Hustle. And guys, I definitely suggest anybody go out and pick up this book. And I've also talked to your publicist, and there are 3 books that we will be giving away. So we'll be doing a little contest where people will be following your pages, following mine, and then they'll be entered in for a giveaway. So there will be 3 copies of Charlie Hustle out there for you guys. So all the listeners, go ahead and make sure you follow the socials. Look down in the description below and look at the links to make sure that you're following Keith O'Brien and all the wonderful things he's got going on. And again, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate you being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
Cheers, man. You take care.
Thank you, George. You too.
Thank you.